All right. So um, today we're doing the Jacob story, uh, or parts of it. It's too long to really do the whole thing. Jacob story, maybe better termed the Jacob cycle. It is a linear story, yes, but it's got clear episodes and it has recurring characters and themes. Um, and at its center, of course, is Jacob, who is in a sense the first real character in the Bible. Um, Maybe the second real character if we count God, which I suppose probably we should. Um, Jacob, of course, will become Israel over the course of these chapters. Uh, and throughout the Bible, not just in the Pentateuch, not just in Genesis, Jacob will be another name for Israel, right? So you'll find in the Psalms references to, the house of Jacob, or simply Jacob, and it will refer to Israel. Although often when people outside of the Pentateuch refer to Jacob, they're actually referring to the northern kingdom of Israel, um, not the entire nation. Um, Remembering that, of course, there comes a point early in Israel's history when it splits into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Jacob is a term used for the north, for the place we call Israel. So knowing that Jacob becomes Israel, it's actually hard not to read a lot of this Jacob material as more than just an individual's story. Right? Individuals in these chapters stand for larger entities, and the relationships between individuals in these stories stand for relationships between entire peoples. At the same time, though, these are stories about individuals, character development, there are narrative arcs, there's emotion. I want to talk today about some of these characters and how they're presented to us as readers. And I want to explore both sides of the Jacob cycle today. That is the story, the individuals, and the symbol, right? The larger entities they stand for. I want to think about how those two things interact, how they influence each other, and how we read texts that are, in a sense, doing two things at once. Uh, so let's start with, I'm going to share my screen now. Let's start with the figure at the center of the text. Of course, Jacob. Our first image of Jacob is coming out of the womb, holding on to his older brother's heel. So obviously, this is in part just an etymology for his name. The word heel in Hebrew is ekev, right? So Jacob, Yaakov, is the one who ekev, right, who heals. But this birth story is actually a pretty good guide to who this character is going to be. Jacob grasps, right? He pulls himself up in the world by climbing over others. And in almost the next breath in the story, we get our first example of this, which is Jacob's purchase of Esau's birthright. And it's from this story and from a few others in the cycle also that we get the notion of Jacob as this classic sort of trickster figure, right? We're told right from the beginning, right, that he's not a hunter, he's not an outdoorsman, right? Like, he's an indoor kid, right? He's a mother's boy. The point is, Jacob is never going to win any fights through brute strength. And indeed, over the course of his story, right, like, he never will really win any fights through brute strength. There's one wrestling match, but I wouldn't say he wins it. Right? This is to be contrasted with, for example, Abraham, who actually like wages literal wars in his story. And Jacob is largely what we would today call conflict averse, is a good term for it. Now, the usual idea of the trickster figure in stories is one who uses his wits to outsmart the powerful, or in some cases just generally cause havoc, which isn't really the kind of trickster that Jacob is. But using his wits to outsmart the powerful. And I think maybe there is one part of the Jacob cycle that is actually a trickster story, but this one with the birthright, this one ain't it, right? Esau isn't powerful here, right? He's desperate. He's tired. He's hungry. What Jacob does to Esau here is not a trick, right? It's basically just extortion. Esau, to be sure, is not portrayed as particularly smart or savvy here, but like, I think we're kind of past the idea of just like delighting in the stupidity of others, right? So I don't get any sort of great joy out of poor simple Esau getting, getting his birthright taken out from under him. Now, obviously, the story as we have it in the text is pro Jacob, right? The concluding line of the story is, and thus Esau spurned his birthright. But I gotta say, Esau spurning his birthright is not really what feels like is happening here, right? Esau's just starving, and Jacob refuses to give him the food he needs until he's given up his birthright. So, what's the story telling us? What's it trying to explain? In every generation in Genesis, from Abraham on, there's two characters, of whom only one gets the promised land, right? So Abraham and Lot come together, and Lot makes the not so great decision to go live in the Dead Sea region, leaving Abraham with Canaan. In the next generation, Ishmael gets sent off into the wilderness by Sarah. So Isaac, who remains, gets Canaan. And then here we have Jacob and Esau. Well, Esau's the older brother. Why doesn't he get the promised land? This is why, right? This is the story of why Esau doesn't live in Canaan, but Jacob does, right? Esau should have gotten it, but he gave it up for soup. What the story is recognizing, right? Remembering that Esau is in this very story, we're told, right, is the same as is to be identified with the nation of Edom, right? The nation directly to the south of Israel. What the story recognizes is that the Edomites to the south and the Israelites to the north are pretty similar, right? They're similar enough that we can imagine they had related ancestors. Their languages are practically identical. Probably almost everything else about them is practically identical too. So how come, since we're so similar, we live here and they live down there? Well, the answer is they could have lived here, but Esau was hungry one day, right? So that's the symbolic level of the story, right? That's the level on which the story is operating as an explanation, right, for a historical fact. We live here and they live there. So, okay, I understand it on that level, but on the level of the narrative, it's just a story about a nasty younger brother who like steals something from his big brother, extorts something even. I feel much the same about the famous story of Jacob disguising himself to gain Esau's blessing in Genesis 27. This also isn't a trickster story, right? It's Jacob taking advantage of his father's old age and blindness, right? Isaac is literally on his deathbed here, right? He's not powerful, right? Also, it's Isaac. This is Abraham's son, Jacob's father. He's part of the promised land. I don't think we're supposed to delight necessarily in Jacob taking advantage of Isaac of all people, right? That's not a trickster. Isaac isn't like the powerful figure here that Jacob is, using his wits to outsmart, right? So over the course of the two stories here, Jacob gets Esau's birthright and his blessing. But it's worth asking, I wonder, like, at what cost? And in a sense, even more so, to what benefit? So a quick reminder, neither the birthright nor the blessing that Jacob takes from Esau are actually particularly useful in the story we have in Genesis, right? So we can back out for just a second. We just talked about this a little bit, but what's the birthright, right? Birthright is priority in terms of inheritance, right? The eldest brother gets the best land. That's terrific. What land does Isaac have to bestow on his children? Jacob gets the birthright and then spends the rest of his life moving around. He doesn't inherit a damn thing in terms of land. And what's the blessing? The blessing is the father's predictive word for the child's future. These were meant to have real world effects. You can think back, right? We had Noah blessing and cursing his sons back earlier in Genesis, and later on, Jacob will offer his own blessing on his 12 sons in Genesis 49, and there he will describe their natures and their territory, the tribes they'll become. And the idea is Jacob's words authentically determine the future. So here, the word that Jacob offers, the blessing that the words that Isaac offers, that Jacob deceives him into giving, these words are lovely. You know, abundance of agriculture. That's a very nice thing, right? Mastery over your brothers. And we might all pause for a second and think, brothers, plural, right? Like, there's only one, as far as we know. What are we gonna make of that? But in any case, however many there are, this notion of mastery over the sibling, who in this case I think just has to be Esau, right? In the story, that doesn't happen, right? Jacob never overmasters Esau in this narrative. And honestly, when Esau gets his like second class blessing from Isaac after Jacob took the good one, it says the same. You shall serve your brother, but eventually break his yoke. Like, again, that doesn't happen in Genesis. That never happens between the two brothers, right? Or rather, right, it doesn't happen in this story world, right? Again, these are references to the distant future. They're symbolic, right? These are references to the future from the perspective of the story, international relations between Israel and Edom, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. And these symbolic references, right, that understanding that this is actually about something else, those obviously inflect our reading. But I want to suggest that we should be careful about how much it inflects our reading. There are two things happening at once here. There's a story and a symbol. The text, clearly to my mind, is a sort of coded explanation for historical events, but it can't just be that. The symbolic reading can't obscure the surface of the story. So my proposal then is that we read these blessings and this blessing on the children, we read them not as symbols, right? Not as things looking ahead to the future of Israel and Edom's international relations, but within the world of the story themselves, I think we might read them as just plot devices. That is, the birthright and the blessing here don't, as I said, function as immediate truths. What they are, rather, right, Jacob's taking of the birthright and the blessing from Esau is actually really more becomes the narrative impulse, right, within the story that drives Esau's anger, and thus Jacob's flight away from him, and thus his move to Aram, and his meeting of Rachel and Leah, and his 12 children, and everything that comes from it. None of that happens without Esau seeing Jacob getting a birthright and a blessing he believes to be his, even if in the actual story world, those things don't actually become important as, you know, as entities in themselves, right? They motivate the story. So I'm trying to make the case that in these sort of classic stories of Jacob, he's not really a trickster in the way that I think he's often portrayed or thought to be. But he does have one legitimate trickster moment, which is in his encounter with Lavan, right? Known to some English speakers as Laban, but that hurts my ears and mind. So I'm going to call him Lavan. Similarly, I call Satan Satan. So what are you going to do? But Lavan, who I'm going to come back to more extensively in a few minutes. But for now, right, this is a real trickster moment. Here, Jacob is encountering someone who has real power over him, and someone who proves in the course of the story to be just as tricky as Jacob is ever thought to be. The conflict with Lavan is really, it's a battle of wits, or in Jacob's case, of a sort of magic, right? Your father has cheated me. He changed my wages, right? But I sort of used this magic with the flocks to come out okay. So it is. It's sort of a battle of wits and magic, but it's another case of Jacob's conflict aversion. Not only does he do all of this like secret trickery breeding flocks, he then sneaks off with his family and flocks in the middle of the night, and it's Lavan who will chase after and confront Jacob, not the other way around. Jacob's just trying to get away. Lavan will confront him. And then on his way home, Jacob will encounter Esau upon his return. And same thing happens, right? Anything other than confrontation, right? I'll send gifts in advance. I'll send messengers. Maybe he'll be nice to me and we won't have to like square off. A couple of chapters later, Jacob's daughter, Dinah, is taken by force. Does Jacob make a big stink of it? Nope. He's going to keep quiet. He waits for his sons to come, and they're the ones who take matters into their own hands. And when they do, Jacob complains that they've caused him trouble. Conflict averse is really a fine word for what he is. All of this to say, if it isn't clear by now, I don't find Jacob to be a very sympathetic character. Now, obviously, he's the protagonist of the story, right? He is Israel. But he's also simultaneously like deceptive and spineless. Fortunately for me, in my opinion of him, Jacob's story arc takes all of that into account because Jacob will get his comeuppance. Jacob the deceiver becomes, of course, Jacob the deceived, and with wonderful narrative irony, right? Jacob, who deceived his father by means of an animal skin, is himself deceived by his sons by means of an animal skin. And Jacob, who pretended to be his brother, thereby obscuring his father's ability to recognize him, believes his sons when they pretend to have their brother's remains, Joseph's remains, and they demand to him, right, recognize this. So there's a whole constellation of the animal skins, the kid, and the notion of recognition and trickery and lying. There's this whole complex that like Jacob inaugurates with tricking Isaac, and his sons replay right back to him, a generation later. So I don't feel so bad about Jacob not being my favorite character because like he gets what's coming to him in the end. Tradition, right, and even biblical tradition, but certainly interpretive tradition, again, takes Jacob as the hero. And his behavior here, right, that I've called kind of just nasty, but is sometimes called, trickery in a good sense. His behavior and his actions become in the interpretive tradition redeemed by virtue of just who he is, right? He is our collective ancestor. And so presumably he's not like a bad guy. So he's doing all these things that I consider to be nasty things. It can't just be a bad guy. It must be something else, right? We have to understand it some other way. But it's interesting that even throughout all these stories, the Bible doesn't actually give us much of a hero here. It gives us rather a relatively, at least in biblical terms, a relatively complex and complicated human who suffers from human character flaws and suffers for those flaws. Even if he's also Israel, is what I'm trying to say. Jacob isn't a type. He's not a mere cipher for some, external, larger, broader whole. Jacob is actually the first, as I said, nearly full character in the Bible. And I would say perhaps the only full character in the Bible other than David, again, leaving aside Yahweh, who I think in many senses is the fullest character of all. And brief book recommendation here if you haven't read it, but Jack Miles' book, God, a Biography, is like a magnificent study of God as a character, right? As a developing, changing character in the story. Very much worth your time. Okay. if Jacob is understood as the hero of the story, then traditionally, there's no question that the big villain of the story is Esau. In classical Jewish interpretation, Esau became identified not just with Edom, right, which is what the Bible associates him with, not just with Edom, but Esau becomes identified as Rome, right, which for classical Judaism was like the ultimate enemy. So Esau, right, jumps from this minor country in the south to the south of Israel to being a symbol of the greatest enemy Judaism had ever encountered, at least at the time. That's Jewish interpretation. In some early Christian interpretation, this is my favorite. Esau becomes identified, amazingly enough, with Jews, and Jacob becomes identified as the Christian church. Right? That to me is like, that's the best stealing of stuff. It's so good. Like, just go ahead and take it all. Anyway, so Esau becomes the Jews, Jacob becomes the church. So again, Esau again as the villain, right? That comes, by the way, that identification comes from the early church father Tertullian in a aptly titled treatise called "Against the Jews." So just so we're clear that Esau is really the enemy there. There is a historical basis. There's a historical basis for animosity, at least between Israel and Edom, right? Edom/Esau. Within the Bible, we're told, right, that David conquered Edom, right? And this conquering of Edom may be the basis in large part for that blessing, right? You will become master over your brothers, or for Esau's counter blessing, right? Your brother will be master over you. That may be a reference to David's conquest of Edom. But a couple hundred years later, 300+ years later, when Israel got conquered by Babylon, right, conquered and exiled, Edom, who were supposed to be helping Israel, Edom treacherously sided with the Babylonians. Treacherously from Israel's perspective. From Edom's perspective, probably very smartly, right, saving their own skins by siding with the inevitable victor here. But here we have Ezekiel. I put up the verse where Ezekiel accuses Edom of treachery and incurring guilt. So David conquered Edom. Edom eventually betrayed Judah and sided with the Babylonians. And when, after the Babylonian exile, Israel sort of was gone, that is, the Israelite people were in exile, the Edomites down in the south kind of took over a big chunk of what was southern Israel. And in fact, this anger between the two parties was so stark that we have an entire biblical book, a whole book of the Bible that's devoted entirely to railing against Edom for this. And that book is the single chapter of Obadiah. Okay, so it's one chapter long, but it's a whole book. It's in every, when you count the books, it's there. Anyway, but the entirety of Obadiah is about Edom and its treachery. This is all to say that there is a good historical rationale for the anti-Esau interpretive tradition. Right? There's good reason for Israel and its interpreters and everything to have this negative view of Edom and therefore Esau as a villain. But what there isn't is a good literary rationale for reading Esau as the villain in Genesis itself. In Genesis itself, Esau is, by contrast, the victim, the sympathetic character, by far the more gracious person. And again, I'm going to assume that we're all decent enough humans not to read Esau negatively just because he's depicted as a hunter, right? Not just because he's a little simpler. right? There was a time when for sure I would have read the text this way. I would have been like, you know, I was the indoor kid, right, who had to outsmart everybody with wit. So like for sure, the like, you know, this Esau was like the jock, right, the bully. But that's not actually, it's not actually there, right? He just liked hunting and wasn't, you know, quite so bookish as his brother. Those aren't bad things. Um, uh, Esau is decidedly the victim in the birthright episode, right? Despite the narrator's attempt even to say, right, Esau spurned the birthright. That's not how that story goes. He's decidedly the victim in the blessing episode, right, where Jacob steals the blessing from him and tricks Isaac. And in neither one of those episodes has he done anything at all wrong. He's done literally nothing wrong in either one of those stories. And yet he comes out on the short end of the stick. Esau gets what is, to my mind, the maybe the single most emotionally charged moment of the entire Bible, right? And I have it in full here, because it's just, again, I can't really I can't read it without feeling it, right? Esau hears his father say that Jacob came and tricked him, and he bursts into sobbing, right? Bless me too, father. And there's something, and I said this last week with the Abraham and Isaac story, right? There's something about sons calling their fathers, you know, my father or father, and fathers referring to their kids here also, right? Like my son, which happens in our story too, right? I've given him I've given him servants. I've sustained him with grain and wine. What can I still do for you, my son? It's heart wrenching. But you know, Esau is bitter, but not just bitter, right? Have you not reserved a blessing for me? It's so sad. It's so sad. He's just a kid who, you know, has been, something important has been taken from him. Um, you know, and the last line, have you but one blessing, father? Bless me too, father. The repetition of father there kills me every time. And he's weeping. I just like, this is to me the most like legitimate, the only one that comes close, just to digress momentarily, the only moment in the whole Bible for me that comes close to this is David weeping over Absalom. And that used to get me a lot more until I thought more about David and realized that I thought that entire thing was performative because, of course, David is the one who had Absalom killed. So I found it less moving as a result of that. um, yes, there's still sadness there, but not like this. This is the most genuine. And look how much, I wasn't really in this for the narrative style like I did last week, but look at how much space the narrator, the author gives to Esau's emotions here. This could have been handled in one verse, right? Esau said, what, you only have one blessing? And Jacob said, sorry, right? But we get this extended scene of just heartbreak. Anyway, so I don't understand anybody who reading this text couldn't feel sympathy for Esau. And maybe Esau's single misstep in the entirety of Genesis, maybe, is his threat to kill Jacob. But in context, after we just read the previous thing, in context, who can blame him? Jacob has taken everything from him. And we should remember too, when the opportunity comes, Esau doesn't actually do this, right? This is the angry response of somebody who has just had stuff stolen from him, his whole life stolen from him, really. And he doesn't end up acting on it. So the other place that people sometimes see Esau as not great, and I was here for a long time, Esau's marriages. I used to always read as a kind of rebellion, right? So Esau sees that that Isaac and Rebekah have sent Jacob off to marry from within the family, right? They sent him off to Rebekah's people. He sees, right, that that the Canaanite women around are displeased Isaac. Isaac doesn't want his kids to marry them. Right. And so I always then read the following thing is, so Esau was like, oh, that displeases you? I'm not going to marry from the family either. And he went to this other people, to the Ishmaelites. But that's not what's happening here. Right. I read that in the sense of Ishmaelites as being not part of the family. But they are. Esau is actually trying to do exactly what his father would want. He doesn't go to the Canaanites. He goes to Abraham's family, right? Ishmael's like his uncle, right? He's going to, he's trying to marry within the family too. It's just like he doesn't quite get it right? He goes to like the wrong part of the family. Like I feel so bad for the guy. He just wants things to go well, and he just can't do anything right. There's nothing he can do about any of it. Now, 20 plus years later in the story, when Jacob returns, he is, of course, afraid of Esau, as we saw before. He sends the gifts, right? The whole thing. It's just one of my favorite scenes in all of Genesis. When they meet, Esau couldn't be more gracious. Right? He outclasses Jacob in every way. Jacob is worried that Esau is going to attack him. Esau runs to him, but runs to hug and kiss him. Esau asks after Jacob's family. Esau rejects Jacob's gifts. And look at how Esau says, I have enough, brother. Right? Again, that sort of family relationship expressed verbally. Right? Isaac never calls Esau brother. Right? Esau says, no, I have enough, brother. You keep what's yours. Esau offers to accompany Jacob on his journey. Whatever your pace is, I'd be happy to go with you. When Jacob rejects that, Esau says, fine, take some of my men to assist you and protect you on your journey. Honestly, this encounter to me may be the finest character moment of anyone in all of Genesis. I can't think of anybody who has a better moment of just being a wonderful, classy human being than Esau does, especially given what Jacob did to him, than Esau does right here. I think you have to do so much interpretive work to make Esau into the bad guy in this story, even though that's naturally where we all sort of start from, right? Of course, Jacob's the good one. He gets the promise, and Esau's the bad one, and he doesn't. But yeah, again, you have to do so much work. How do you turn Jacob into the bad guy? Oh man, you have to do crazy stuff. Do you know what classical Jewish midrash does to make Esau into the bad guy? When Jacob and Esau meet in the scene I was just talking about, and Jacob runs to hug and kiss him, the midrash says, or the classical rabbi said, no, Esau was trying to bite Jacob's neck, right? But which is absurd. But this is the kind of work you have to do to turn this wonderful, warm moment into, to turn Esau here into the bad guy that your tradition has decided that he is. You simply have to read completely against the text in that way. One last note on this. Right? When Isaac does eventually die, Jacob and Esau will bury him together. Right? There's no animosity there. Just two brothers burying their father. Right? We're accustomed through our interpretive traditions to treat and depict Esau as the bad guy, right? The oaf, the lout. It's just not who he is in the story. Right? So I think to read Genesis, that really the story of Genesis is actually to redeem Esau from millennia of interpretation of Genesis. Okay. A brief word about Lavan, who is who's actually the easiest villain in the story. He's just unremittingly nasty. And in the end, of course, Jacob will triumph, or at least get out from under Lavan's thumb, and they'll sign a treaty. Here, too, it's hard not to see the historical symbolism at work. Just the way that Esau stands for Edom in the south, Lavan here stands for Aram, right? The Arameans, this collection of nation states to the north of Israel. And I think I've pointed out in the past, and it's worth always remembering, that Israel, despite being the main character of the Bible, one way of putting it, historically was not particularly important, and certainly was never powerful, and was always under foreign rule or foreign influence. And for most of Israel's early history, the Arameans were considerably more powerful and more important than they were. And we can actually see that status, that international status from Israel's history, reflected here in the relative status of our characters in the story. Lavan has it all over Jacob in the story. The best Jacob can do is escape Lavan with his wives and his flocks and just hope that things will remain peaceful. And you know, if this is the sort of thing that you find interesting, we could also probably do even a little bit of like rough dating of when these stories come from. That is, we can probably say that these Jacob Lavan stories, right, this story that represents the international relationship between Israel and the Arameans, probably come from a reasonably early period. How do I know that? Because the Aramean independent city-states were destroyed by the Assyrian army in the late 8th century. So really 100 years before, 100 years before the Assyrians came through what we call Israel. The Arameans were already destroyed. So that suggests that traditions underlying these stories, right, traditions about Israel and the Arameans sort of making treaties and being in some sort of conflict, those must go back before the 8th century. We can actually say the same thing to an extent about the Esau stories, as I've suggested, right? We see that in the Bible, Esau, as Edom, becomes the villain after Edom betrays Israel or Judah in the time of the Babylonian exile. So if the stories in Genesis portray Esau not in that negative, betraying light, then probably they also come from some time before the Babylonian conquest, before Edom turned on Israel and became such a bad guy. So again, there's like good, interesting historical symbolism to be seen in these stories. There's no doubt about it. I'm not trying to downplay that stuff. I just think that we need to not focus entirely on it, as if the whole point of these stories is to like secretly in code give us the sort of history of international relationships. I'm not sure that's what's going on here. Okay, that was Jacob, Esau, Lavan. Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines. The concubines are Zilpah and Bilhah, are totally character-free. They speak not a single word in the entire story. The wives, Leah and Rachel, are, of course, a little more fully drawn, but only a little. Rachel gets a slightly more active role, right? She's the one who's tending the flock when Jacob arrives. She's the one who brings Jacob to her father. She's the one who will steal her father's idols, though it's not at all clear why she's stealing her father's idols. Like maybe it's just payback. Rachel will, of course, bear Jacob's most beloved children, Joseph and Benjamin. But does Rachel have a real character that we could describe here? Not really, right? She's no Rebecca, who is the best drawn of all the matriarchs, and not even, she's not even a Sarah. Rachel's identity is to be loved by Jacob, right? To be barren and then not barren. And to have maybe in the stealing of her father's idols, maybe to have one moment where she emulates Jacob's deceptiveness, right? Like, I don't know, I'm going to steal some idols and then trick you into thinking I don't have them. Maybe like showing us that like the 2 of them really belong together, Rachel and Jacob. I don't know. And then poor Leah. It wasn't her decision to be the pawn in the like marriage switcheroo trick. And now she has to spend her entire eternity known as the unloved wife, right? That's who Leah is. She's the unloved wife. And when she names her 4 sons, her first 4 sons, right, that testifies to her unhappiness. Look at how she names them, right? Reuben, because it means now my husband will love me. And then Simeon, because the Lord heard I was unloved. And then Levi, because now my husband will become attached to me. I've borne him 3 sons. It's so, like, I find it so sad. And eventually she'll bear him 6 sons. It's still not enough. Even with the 6th one, she's saying, this time my husband might like me. I've given him 6 kids. And while Rachel's sons become victims in the story to come, Joseph and Benjamin, Leah's kids in the story are like, they're cads. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, right? Every one of those 4 becomes narratively problematized in Genesis. Every one of them. Leah will never overcome this initial non-preference. Right? When Jacob comes to greet Esau, right, he puts his like concubines and wives in order, right, so that if Esau should attack, right, he'll get to the ones he likes last. right? So Leah gets put in front of Rachel, right? Rachel with her kids are all the way at the back, just in case Esau gets tired of slaughter, I don't know, before he gets there, right? And weirdly, for poor Leah, again, like we don't even know when she dies. Rachel's got a whole deathbed, like she's got a whole scene. She got a deathbed speech. What woman in the Bible gets a deathbed speech? Rachel does. I don't even know, but there's no notice of Leah dying in the story. All I know is later on they say, oh yeah, and I buried Leah in the family plot. She's almost defined by what she doesn't get. Right? She speaks far less than Esau, but I find her equally sympathetic. And for similar reasons, right? She's sort of structurally second class through no fault of her own. Lest we forget, there's historical symbolism in Jacob's wives too. Jacob's beloved wife Rachel is the mother of Benjamin and Joseph, Jacob's beloved sons. And the territories of the tribes of Benjamin and Joseph occupy the central highlands. Right? That's the most powerful and most important areas of Israel are the ones that belong to, in the story, Rachel's kids. The relationships among the tribes in history and reality are represented by their lineage in the story itself. And lest we forget, or lest we never have known, the very idea that all the tribes are related and go back to Jacob, to Israel, is itself a fiction that was generated to justify a historical reality. Right? The story of the Bible tells us that Israel started out as one people, right, one guy, with 12 subdivisions, 12 kids. But in reality, Israel started out as 12 independent tribes. Probably there were more than 12 at one point. And those 12 tribes sort of came together to become one nation, one people. It's actually, we can think about this as similar lines, along similar lines with the US, right? Originally independent states that came together to form a single nation, right? In our case, that's both historically accurate and it's the story that we tell about how the nation came to be. But imagine if we told a story in which like originally a group called the United States traveled from England, right? And when they arrived, they like sent various members of their group out to settle the various areas of what is now the US, right? We'd know that's wrong, though it would be kind of just as plausible narratively, right? That's what the Bible has done, right? The Bible's narrative version of Israel's history is, no, we all started as one thing, and then we just sort of subdivided. Whereas again, right, in reality, it's the other way around. That is to say, the story doesn't give us history, not accurate history, but history drives aspects of the story, even basic things that we take for granted, like 12 tribes. But for all we may be able to say about how the story represents history, history doesn't explain the entire story, right? Leah's anguished desire to be loved by Jacob has no historical symbolic value, right? That's still just the story of these individuals, the narrative. Whatever lies in the background in terms of the history behind it, the surface of the text is still narrative with characters. So, in closing, the biblical narrative can be read as lots of things. It can be read as coded historical commentary, as symbolism, as a myth, as typology. And in a sense, the cultural value we've placed on the Bible almost demands that it be something more than just what it purports to be. But it is, first and foremost, what it presents itself as. That is, it is narrative, it's literature, it's characters and plots. It's the creation of a story world and then the populating of that world. How those characters move through the world may not always be exactly how we want them or expect them to be, or what our tradition would suggest that they should be doing. But we should remember, it was these stories that inspired the tradition and the interpretation. And the depth and the nature of the characterization, even for someone relatively underdeveloped like Leah, is relevant to the narrative story world. Then there are parts of the biblical story that just don't contribute at all to symbolic or typological or mythological or historical readings, right? They don't contribute at all to any of that symbolic stuff. They're just part of good, deep character storytelling. And we should, I think, take that as a reminder that even if historical scenarios, historical background may have generated the narrative, right, is the rationale for it, the thing that the narrative is trying to explain, what we have in front of us are stories first and historical symbols second. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to pull up, if I can, let me see if I can get to it, the questions. I didn't have them open yet, which is my fault. Okay, and here we go. Let me look at some of the questions I've got here. What do I want to look at? Lots of questions about Rebecca and Rebecca's role in the Jacob Esau stuff. I will admit, I blame Jacob, right? But of course, in the story, the whole thing with the stealing of the blessing, the whole thing with the disguising, that's all Rebecca's doing. It's clear that Rebecca is quite bright and quite aggressive in getting what she wants. This isn't the first time it's felt this way with her. And, you know, we're told at the beginning that Jacob is, you know, sort of a mama's boy. So in a sense, it's a little like mother, like son, is what we have going on here. I don't want to, I don't want to undersell Jacob's responsibility here. Right? He does do the thing, and it seems to be in line. Remember, he didn't learn it from her. He had already stolen the birthright in the previous narrative, a couple of chapters earlier. But you know, had I done a section on Isaac and Rebecca, Rebecca would have gotten much more attention. She's a wonderful character who, you know, is clearly just trying to do the best for the child she loves. There's a lot to be said there, and I'm not going to say it here, but there's a lot to be said there about you know, insights into the relationships of parents and kids, with, you know, Isaac favoring Esau and Rebecca favoring Jacob. But yes, I take everybody who made that comment. I take your point. We shouldn't just blame Jacob for what happens in that chapter. Rebecca is clearly a large motivating factor. Okay. How was ownership of the birthright tracked? That is, say, you know, the birthright simply belongs to the eldest son, and then it's swapped, right? He trades it for soup. What's the thing that's traded there? Who's marking that? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer. I don't think that they had like they certainly didn't have contracts. And honestly, I'm not even 100% sure that this is really a thing that could happen, right? I'm not sure that you really could sell your birthright like this, right? So again, I want to make sure that we're not trying to fit, trying to shove reality and story into one single clean box. Right? It's somebody asked, it was weeks ago. One of the questions someone asked here was like, why even put a tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Like, why is that thing even there if no one's allowed to eat from it, right? Like, what a setup that is, right? Like, and yes, right? Like, logically, that's a reasonable question. It's there because it moves the narrative, right? These are stories, and we need to think of them less as like, you know, why would somebody actually do that, and more, what does it contribute to the plot? And so here the birthright works in that sense. So why, someone asks, so why does everyone see Esau as the villain? Right? Do we need to make one of them a villain? And obviously, I don't think so. Maybe I do think so, and I think it's Jacob. No, I don't know. Not the same kind of villain. Why do we need to make someone a villain? You know what it is? I mean, I think there's a natural tendency when we've got two characters or two brothers, right? One is the villain and one's the good guy. And clearly in the story, um, what we have is a line of preference. We have a line of the promise, right? The promise to send Abraham through Isaac through Jacob. And the other characters, though they could be perfectly fine people, Ishmael's a totally fine person, right? There's nothing wrong with Ishmael as a character. There's really nothing wrong with Lot as a character, except he has bad, real estate instincts. Um, uh, they're all okay people. But when you tell me one child is the blessed recipient of the recipient of God's blessing, we instinctively assign curse to the other one, correctly or not. Um, and certainly, uh, again, thinking about the historical underpinnings here, these stories, all of them, going Lot also, are all stories of Israel's understanding of its relationship with its neighbors. Right? Lot is the progenitor of the Ammonites and the Moabites. Right? Do we think anything really bad about those people? We don't actually, which is why Lot's character is basically fine. Um, okay, so they come from incest. Like that's more of like a joke at their expense than it is anything really about their character. Um, do they have anything against the Ishmaelite tribes? Not really, but like they're not us, right? Not us is the answer. So it's about identity, right? The line goes through the character, the preferred characters, and everybody else is off to the side. And again, it's not unlike what I said a couple of weeks ago in terms of with the call of Abraham. We see that Abraham becomes the chosen one, and we feel the need to assign to him some sort of inherent value or worth that makes him deserving of being the chosen one. What we're seeing here is sort of the flip side of that. Right? If they're not the chosen ones, so why not? Right? Like there must be something wrong with them that they should have not gotten what our deserving ancestors did get. I'd be really interested. I don't know enough about this. I would assume that there have been enough studies of sort of folk traditions um, that of stories that incorporate two brothers or pairs that would demonstrate this kind of one good, one bad, even if not in the story, in interpretive tradition. It seems very natural to me, and which is why, in part, as I read, especially Jacob and Esau, I fight so strongly against it, especially because Esau, of all people, gets so maligned in the interpretive tradition when his story is truly like maybe the best human in the entirety of Genesis. I don't think I'm overstating when I say that. Like I said it for the first time out loud just now. It sounds right to me. I think he's the best. He has no reason to be as good as he is when Jacob comes back, but he's so good. Okay. Let's see. Some interesting questions here. I love it. So somebody said, and I'll do this one quickly because I like it. In Genesis, we repeatedly have the younger son being favored over the older. Abel, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Cain, Ishmael, Esau, Reuben. There's plenty of other examples. This like the younger one. I mean, there aren't plenty of other examples, but it's clear, right? Isaac more than over, etc. What's the significance of this theme? And the end question, which I think is going to sort of answer the question for itself, is this a justification for Solomon's claim to the throne over his older brothers? And I'm pretty tempted to say yes, right? The story of David and Solomon, right, where Solomon is the fourth of the brothers and becomes the king, like Judah is the fourth of the brothers and is the tribe that David comes from. I don't know how coincidental I think that is. I suspect, and there's not time to talk about it here, but I suspect that David and David's story and especially David's uniting of the disparate tribes into one nation, had far more influence on the stories in Genesis and elsewhere than we are usually aware of. And I'll sort of leave it there. And I think if you care more about this, right, I have a book about David that goes into this somewhat. Let me see if I can get to a couple of other ones. I like this question. Is midrash relevant to biblical scholarship? Right, that is, this like huge body of Jewish interpretive tradition. I brought up the example here of Esau was trying to bite Jacob's neck, not trying to kiss him. Is these reams and reams of stories and interpretations that come from classical Jewish sources, basically from the first millennium CE. Is any of it relevant to biblical scholarship? And I'll extend it and not to be not to leave anyone out, right? What about early Christian interpretive tradition, right? There's in a sense no reason that one should be more relevant than the other. As I sort of tried to say a week or two ago, both Judaism and Christianity are traditions of interpretation of this text. So neither one of them has priority in terms of like truthfulness or accuracy or like interpretive authority. The only difference is that a lot of early Christian tradition is interested in sort of wiping Judaism away from the Jewish text, and Jewish tradition is less so. But the answer to the question is absolutely it is, right? It's absolutely relevant to biblical scholarship. It's not just like in particular ways, right? There is almost no post-biblical interpretive tradition that reveals to us anything, particularly meaningful or insightful about what the text meant at an earlier stage, right? Whatever Jewish midrash or early Christian readers took the text to mean does not say to us, oh, that must be what it meant early on. That must be what it originally meant. It's not relevant to that in the slightest. The history of interpretation and original meaning, as far as we can get at it, are two separate, in a sense, separate discussions to be had. But what midrash and other interpretive traditions do for us as readers is two things. First of all, knowing them helps clarify where our ideas of what the text means come from, right? Why do we instinctively think Edom is bad? Because early interpreters declared Edom to be bad, right? It affects the way that we have all read the text ever since, even if we're not aware of it, right? We don't come into our interpretive traditions, our faith traditions, our reading traditions. We don't come in with a full knowledge of everything that everyone said before us, right? We're just getting the tail end. So knowing those interpretive traditions is incredibly useful for recognizing why we think certain things about the text now that may not be what they may originally meant, right? So it helps us to be able to peel away some of the layers of interpretation to get at what the text may have meant underneath. I find that super valuable. The other thing that knowing interpretive traditions does, early interpretive traditions, what that gives us is it gives us something of, I'll give you two other things. It gives us something of a control for what bugged people as readers. Like remembering that especially early Jewish readers, but some early Christian readers also, were like much, much better, closer readers than almost any of us is today. And so if they're bothered by something in the text, I should pay attention to that. They're not going to have the same answer as me, right? But they notice things. They notice the tiniest difference in like word choice or even in conjugation of words, right? They're so attuned to the text that it really reminds us like how careful they were as readers, and prompts us to be careful readers in the same way. And also that, for my purposes, also their readings illustrate that that there are problems and difficulties in the text, right? They read the text and they say, how can it say this and this, right? So like, that's not just me who has that problem, right? Like everybody's always had that problem. What we do with it, again, is going to be different. But early interpreters give us like a wonderful set of lenses through which to view the text. Again, we're not going to answer anything necessarily in the same manner, but the whole point of biblical criticism, of biblical scholarship, is asking questions of the text, and they asked the most marvelous questions in a different genre, but they had all the questions already, and so it's incredibly useful for biblical scholarship. Okay, I'm going to end there for now.